For centuries, London has stood as the epicenter of Britain's economic and commercial influence. It remains a hub for some of the world's largest and most prosperous corporations. However, none of these modern versions can rival the sheer power and influence wielded by the East India Company, arguably the most formidable multinational corporation in history. Founded more than 400 years ago, this private enterprise transformed from a modest trading company into the de facto governing power of the Indian subcontinent. At its peak, the East India Company wielded greater military and financial might than many sovereign states. It commanded private armies and systematically dismantled India's established dynasties, replacing their rule with its own dominion. This remarkable ascent to power was fueled by its control over the world's most lucrative trade routes, generating unimaginable wealth for its employees and investors. But how did a private enterprise come to dominate one of the largest and most prosperous regions on Earth? The East India Company was founded at the dawn of the 17th century, though it was not the first enterprise of its kind. By the late 1500s, Spain and Portugal had already established expansive colonial empires. Seeing the immense wealth such ventures provided, other European powers, including England, France and the Dutch Republic, became eager to establish their own footholds overseas. Direct government sponsorship of these expeditions was often too expensive and risky. As a solution, the concept of the joint stock company emerged. This model allowed private investors to pool their resources to fund voyages and share in any profits. The first significant English joint stock company was the Muscovy Company, established in 1555 to trade with Russia. However, English merchants soon recognized the true prize lay further east, in India, China and the East Indies, where exotic goods such as spices, silk and tea could fetch astronomical prices in Europe. In 1600, a consortium of London merchants petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for a royal charter, granting them exclusive rights to trade with the East Indies. Thus, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies was born. Operating under a board of 24 directors, the company dispatched its first fleet to the East Indies, initiating a venture that would soon reshape global trade and governance. The East India Company's early years were fraught with difficulty. Competition from the Dutch East India Company and the Portuguese Empire made it challenging to secure a foothold. However, by the 1610s, the company had gained trading concessions along the Indian coast. A critical milestone came in 1639, when the company acquired land on India's southeastern coast and founded the settlement of Madras. This was followed by the acquisition of Bombay in 1661, part of a marriage alliance between England and Portugal. By the latter half of the 17th century, the company had established several coastal strongholds, laying the foundation for further territorial ambitions. Beyond Asia, the East India Company also engaged in the African slave trade. By sourcing slaves from Eastern Africa, it avoided conflict with the Royal African Company, which dominated West African trade. Unlike their counterparts who transported slaves to the Americas, the East India Company focused on moving enslaved individuals across the Indian Ocean, where they were forced to work in the company's factories in places like Madras and Bombay. The company's fortunes grew steadily, but remained overshadowed by the Dutch throughout the 1600s. The Anglo-Dutch wars, fought during the latter half of the century, reflected the intense rivalry between the two powers. However, the 18th century marked a turning point for the East India Company, ushering in a period of aggressive military expansion. A key figure in the company's ascent was Robert Clive. Joining as a young clerk, Clive rapidly advanced within the company's ranks, particularly during the tumultuous 1740s. By the 1750s, the company had assembled a formidable private army comprised of British and Irish soldiers, as well as native Indian recruits known as sepoys. Clive's strategic acumen became evident during the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Leading a small force equipped with superior weaponry, he defeated the much larger army of the Nawab of Bengal. This victory not only secured Bengal, a region of immense wealth and strategic importance, but also marked the beginning of the company's territorial dominance in India. Over the next few decades, the company expanded relentlessly, often at the expense of local rulers. Although major powers like the Mughal Empire, the Maratha Confederacy, and the Sultanate of Mysore posed significant challenges, the company's superior military technology and organizational efficiency allowed it to prevail. By 1803, the company had even captured Delhi, cementing its control over vast swathes of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The East India Company's dominance extended beyond military conquest. It maintained a monopoly on British trade with India, controlling lucrative commodities like tea and textiles. Additionally, the company extracted enormous revenues through taxation, further enriching its shareholders in London. However, its governance was marked by severe mismanagement. The Bengal famine of 1770 exemplified these failings. Poor administration and an unyielding focus on profit contributed to the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. Despite internal reports highlighting the company's negligence, its leadership in London prioritized financial returns over human welfare. The company also extended its influence beyond India. In China, it engaged in the highly profitable opium trade. Indian-grown opium was smuggled into China despite the Qing dynasty's attempts to suppress the drug's spread. Tensions culminated in the First Opium War, from 1839 to 1842, which saw the British defeat the Qing Empire and seize control of Hong Kong. This conflict forced China to open additional ports to European merchants, expanding British economic influence. By the mid-19th century, the company's oppressive policies sparked widespread resentment across India. In 1857, this discontent erupted into a large-scale rebellion. Known as the Indian Mutiny, the uprising saw native soldiers and civilians rise against the company's rule, particularly in northern regions around Delhi. The rebellion resulted in immense bloodshed, with over 6,000 British personnel and hundreds of thousands of Indians losing their lives. The violence and subsequent humanitarian crises revealed the company's inability to govern effectively. In response, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act in 1858, transferring control of the company's territories to the British Crown. Although stripped of its governing powers, the East India Company lingered for another 15 years, due to prior agreements with the British government. In 1873, the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act officially dissolved the company, compensating its shareholders and marking the end of an extraordinary chapter in global history. The legacy of the East India Company endures as a cautionary tale of corporate power run amok. While modern multinational corporations wield significant influence, none have approached the scale and sovereignty the East India Company once held. Its rise and fall reshaped the political and economic landscapes of Asia and laid the groundwork for the British Raj, which would govern India until its independence in 1947. Ultimately, the company became a victim of its own success, too powerful to be left unchecked, yet too dangerous to be allowed to persist.